Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the AIIA Queensland branch's latest webinar. Tonight, we're delighted to have Rebecca Hall as our guest speaker on a very important subject, both from a strategic point of view, but also from an economic and cultural point of view to Australia. I read recently that Australia was now replacing Britain as the second most popular destination in the world for overseas students to study at. And one really has to think in the context of how other countries have suffered with COVID and some of the very significant social unrest in other countries, that it can only help Australia be more and more a promising market for international students. For those of us like me who are getting older, we know that Australian society is ageing very rapidly. The average migrant, and many of these students become migrants after studying here, is both younger and better educated than the average contributors to this society, whether they stay in this country or not. Tonight, we will hear from Rebecca Hall on her subject matter, COVID and Australia's international education sector, a road to renewal. But first, to tell you a little bit about her. She leads Austrade's engagement, or she has until very recently led Austrade's engagement in promoting Australia's international education sector. As head of the Australian International Centre of Excellence, she forms part of the Trade and Investment Senior Leadership Team. Prior to joining the Australian government, Rebecca led the international education strategy for both the Queensland and Victorian governments. Her career in international education was sparked by her experience as a Japan exchange student participant in 1996. Since returning to Australia in 1998, she has contributed her skill and passion for international education through roles in economic development, international relations, strategy development, and industry engagement. She has worked across local, state, and federal governments, peak bodies, and education providers. Over the past decade, her not-for-profit board experience includes appointments to the International Education Association of Australia, AIIA Queensland, the Queensland Overseas Foundation, and AFS Intercultural Programs Australia. She is a proud alumna of Griffith University, and indeed she started her Asian studies in international business there, and also Bond University and a Master of International Relations. She is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. Interestingly, she has just taken up, or just about to take up, a new position as head of Southeast Asian trade for the Victorian government. So unfortunately, we'll be losing her to Queensland, but not to the great national interest of this country as a whole. I'll now ask Rebecca to address the webinar, both in presence here at Holding Redlink in Brisbane and online. Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having me back here to AIIA Queensland. I learned a lot from my time on the board and volunteering here, and it's a pleasure to be back. Thank you for the very kind introduction there, Lucas, and I do remember not serving directly, but when you were a minister in government here in Queensland, so thank you for your contribution. I would like to firstly acknowledge we're here in Brisbane, but I know many people online as well, acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet here, and where you may be watching and meeting, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Some water as well as I go along, so just forewarning that. To those of you who are listening in, thank you for your interest. I am going to share some perspectives in three components today, and hopefully the slide deck works. A quick look at the current state of international education, in particular the role of my organisation, Austrade, and our Centre of Excellence. What it might take to be together again in terms of our international students who are very interested to return to Australia, or who may be here studying online now. And 4 policy areas that I think are going to shape the path to renewal. Okay, so here we go. Right, Austrade's role during COVID. 2020, I'm not sure about you. If you heard my background, I've actually been fortunate to work in government in international education for most of my career, for more than 20 years. And I came into, we entered 2020 with some trepidation for the international education sector. There were some indicators pointing to slowing demand from our major partner in China, some other challenges in terms of concentration of students in other areas, but I don't think any of us could have predicted the significance of what 2020 has presented. Firstly, with the bushfires, thank you very much, and the impact that they had on international education and our broader reputation as a country, not just in safety, but also in terms of broader policy settings. But then for the international education sector, more than any other industry, of course, every industry, every part of Australia and the world has been impacted by COVID. But the timing, as we now well know, for our students from China or from those countries that were celebrating Chinese New Year and had actually, some of them been in Australia just prior to returned home. And so I'm going to share quite a few statistics tonight as well. These are all open source statistics that you can find, but just bringing them together to show, I guess, the challenge that we face. So let me start with the role of Austrade. When we entered 2020, we had a set work plan, as most of you probably did as well, and we went, right, we're going to need to do things differently. And so we set ourselves a goal here of 9 pivot areas or priority areas in the remit for Austrade. And our role is to promote Australia as a destination and a partner for international education. Of course, Austrade does much more than that, but my small area within the team. And so we knew we had to work differently with states and territories. We knew we had to really listen to what was being said about Australia and the sentiment of what we were hearing. And we had an opportunity to hopefully emerge from this with a new brand. We knew that digital was the only way we were going to be able to communicate, that we needed to deliver real-time market intelligence to our exporters and clients, and we could do that through our network. We could no longer participate in our traditional ways of engaging with students through traditional events or partners through traditional events. We did need to counter and make sure we got messages out, informative messages about the changes that were happening and how they were impacting students. And we knew we had an opportunity around product diversification, creatively called Study with Australia, rather than Study in Australia, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And of course, we've played a role along with the other policy agencies on crisis management. I set that context because that's how I'm presenting to you today. I am not the policy lead on broader strategy or other areas, and I think it's given us a really interesting perspective during the past 6 months. And of course, it's setting us for what will the future look like for international education and what do we want to create for a sector, as Paul mentioned, a $40 billion sector for the Australian economy. But that's, of course, the immediate return. When we start to look at the longer lasting impacts, those of the alum and partners who have engaged with us and their propensity to engage with us and the contributions that are made, it really is much more significant than that. What I wanted to share, I think this is a really interesting perspective if you think of this as an export sector, in terms of we are one of the few export sectors that still has 450,000 of our clients here with us. We are seeking to deliver a service, deliver the information that our students want and desire. And many of them, most of them are here in Australia experiencing that with us. Any other export sector, think of tourism, think of other services sectors, it's a very different experience. You either are here, you're either drinking the Australian wine or you're not, that kind of context. So I think that's really important as we're framing the road to renewal. For us within Austrade, also thinking about the education clients that we're working with. And in this debate, we tend to be very focused on our universities. And of course, they play a pivotal role in international education. But actually the impact on our schools, on our EdTech service providers, on our student accommodation providers just over the road here as well, on our vocational skills and training providers. It's a much deeper and wider ecosystem which gets less, is less well understood, and certainly the media tends to focus predominantly on universities. I think really interesting for a group interested in diplomacy, soft power and international relations is the bilateral impact of having a number of students here with us, or those who are not here with us, and the bilateral impacts. And you may have noticed our first ever virtual summit with Modi and Prime Minister Morrison, and of course international students were part of that conversation. Again, I think that's a really interesting dynamic that is being managed day to day by our networks, by institutions, and of course in a range of conversations that we're having with our partners. I can't go past acknowledging the 250,000 jobs that are generated through international education. And importantly here, these are not just jobs in our institutions. These are multiplier opportunities and other industries that are supported by international education. And some of the data that I think, and in terms of road to recovery as well, is recognising the interconnectedness between international education and tourism, or as we're now calling the visitor economy, and what each of those sectors contributes, particularly in regional Australia. And those jobs, many of those jobs are indeed in regional Australia. And of course, I know I'm probably drawing this bow far too wide, 25 million Australians, I'm including, I don't know how many under 13-year-olds, but never before, this sector, and I've worked in it for 20 years, everyone in Australia is impacted in some way, shape or form, whether you are teaching, whether you are researching, whether you are an employer, whether you are a host family, whether you're in a school, in an environment, whether you travel on public transport, and you read the media. You are seeing and hearing information about a sector that certainly when I first started working in it was not necessarily something that was of broader community interest. And I think when you add all of those numbers together, you can imagine the challenge and the opportunity we have to recover, but also to renew. So one of the areas that we in Austrade had been looking at, just trying to understand Australia's international education sector, and not very creatively, we came up with a model around 8 C's. Because when we talk about international education, we tend to focus on the problem of lack of diversification, over-reliance on a certain market or a certain cohort of students. And actually, what we've been unpacking and wanting to have a more nuanced conversation around is this isn't about any individual country. This is about diversification of where our students choose to study, which cities in Australia they are choosing to study in. And I use this example a lot, I can use it here in Queensland. Our colleagues in Townsville would very much welcome many more students from China. They have, last time I looked, I think 150 enrolments from China in the Townsville area. Great opportunity for growth. So that city, and obviously as it's played out in policy, the regional opportunity for students to be in more dispersed areas. Of course, courses is another area for diversification. I think particularly, Paul, as you introduced the opportunity for what does Australia's post-COVID reputation look like. I think our deep learning and experience, particularly in STEM, in health, in a whole range of areas, they are the areas that we would love to be able to grow more students to come and study with us and to broaden that diversification. But of course, I mentioned study with, so the 4th C is campus, actually redefining our very view of campus. And that actually, for us to really grow and sustain international education, our biggest campus is the cloud. And right now, our biggest campus is the cloud. We've actually delivered on an aspiration that I certainly know I feel like I've been talking about for more than a decade, in terms of being able to open up that access, no matter where you are. Now, this doesn't mean an either or. It doesn't mean that we're suggesting that for international education and for the future that we are only going to be offering online, but it's how we embed those 4 C's and look at that in its totality. There are a couple of others down the bottom there. I'm going to touch on them later on. And if you can see the screen, you can see I'm talking about competition, community, our channels of engagement and cost. And these are factors that are going to determine, I think, how well we recover and what kind of product, service or experience we're able to deliver. So that was the framing and the introduction. So hopefully that has set the scene. I wanted to talk about what it might look like to be together again. I'm using this hashtag together again. One of the calls to action that we have been using very organically during this time is a hashtag in this together. Acknowledging that we don't necessarily have all of our students and our friends here with us now. We don't have all of the answers. We are developing policy and responses as quickly and as equitably as we can. In this together was really a catch cry, and this has been coming up a bit as well, saying, but yes, when will we be together again? So let me continue just some of the data. I don't want to overwhelm you with the data, but it does put it in context, I think, in terms of the size of the challenge. This data is produced on a weekly basis from our colleagues in Home Affairs and also via the Department of Education. And if I had to look at a silver lining, it would be, wow, we have data now that we never thought we could access, and we're getting it on a weekly basis, a real-time weekly basis. So we can see primary student holders by location in each of our states and territories, and see that we have 77% of our students who are currently enrolled in international programs here in Australia, and we have 22.4% outside of Australia. That has largely remained the same over the past 6 months. We've had ebbs and flows. I think we're up to 82% at one stage. And of course, it's quite a different story for our individual states and territories. And I think that's another message around this. International education is so important to every state and territory in Australia in a way that it wasn't certainly when I first joined the sector and started working in strategy and destination management. And Queensland is a really interesting example of that. The Queensland numbers, when you hear or see stories of New Zealand, the New Zealand international education sector is about the same size as the Queensland international education sector, similar regional dispersal with Auckland and Brisbane, and similar number of universities. I'm sharing that because this is going to be an ongoing measure or metric, but it also can't take us away from the broader focus that we need to be looking at. And that is not just how we're going to open borders or secure corridors, but what will it take for us to return globally to open up global student flows? And I guess nothing new here, but how we go about weighing up and measuring these three variables of public health, economy, and politics and policy. And not just for us here in Australia, but of course for our sending and receiving countries. So I'm going to spend the next few slides looking at what I would call the four key factors that are going to shape what's next for Australia's international education. And I've got them all on a slide here, but I'll go through them one by one. And I'm sharing at this level because I really hope to have a conversation with you and with those online around what this might look like for how you're involved in international education or any other information that you have as well. But number one is, of course, how well Australia is progressing against our COVID safe plan. I first used a slide like this probably back in May. Well, when did we announce it? May, June. We were very optimistic about being able to progress against the COVID safe plan, as each state and territory had indicated. And we knew that that was going to be our first measure of what it would look like to being open again. We also knew, though, we could have and we will have a COVID safe Australia and a way of managing the virus, which is the envy of many other countries, and that puts us in a grouping of other countries who have done this well. But we also knew, secondly, for us, this does also depend on our source countries or our competitor countries and how will they recover on those three indicators of health, economy and political. And so looking at it would be fantastic. We would love to be moving forward and progressing on our plans for COVID safe, but also the economies and the students and the parents who choose to invest in international education are deeply impacted in ways that we could not have foreseen. And that is for, of course, some of our bigger sending countries. If we look at our top 3 sending countries, China, India, Nepal, each one of those experiencing various impacts on that health, economy and political scale. So that was both of those, I'd say, at the macro level. At the buyer and the consumer behaviour level, and there's been a lot more research done on this. I'm not a consumer behaviourist, but I can see absolutely student and parent buyer behaviour is changing. And I'm using buyer, I know, in a very commercial sense, but the motivations, the desires, the choices that students and parents are making about international education is changing. And we don't have the data yet to understand that. If I go back to some of the things we were working on in Austrade, it was starting to build some ways that we could gather that insight real time now and not have to wait for a report in a year's time to tell us, yes, students are making these choices. We do know that parents are still playing, and you would expect, a considerable role in choice for students. And that number one choice that parents are playing is around destination. We've seen a bit of a flip in terms of the safety of the destination, the quality of the destination, parents making that choice, and hopefully the choice of course and others being opened up more widely to students. That piece of work and the work we're doing on that, I think, is going to be central to understanding how students' perceptions are changing. Of course, this is the same in the domestic environment as well. And ultimately, when I started the presentation, I spoke about our 450,000 international students who are here with us now and how they experience their education. To put a marketing hat on, we know that those students are our key word of mouth. They are our way to get messages back. They are sharing their stories, both positive and otherwise. So I've spent way too much time on that slide because I forgot I had it in each different slide. But let me just go to how well we are progressing. You would be reading in the media quite a lot of interest around student pilots and open borders for students. I guess it's kind of a no-brainer to put a graph like this. I probably could have made it up myself with the decline of the airline monthly flights into Australia, but I think that is, in terms of infrastructure and what it's going to take to, of course, open back up this opportunity for Australia, we are going to need to work very closely with our airlines. We're going to need to work in a different kind of partnership in order to secure those opportunities. I think there is a great opportunity. States and territories, every one of them is involved in crafting a return policy, not just for students, of course, but for their citizens, for those that may wish to come back into their states to contribute as skilled migrants or otherwise. This is a body of work which is, I think, an amazing effort that you probably can't see all of the details behind, of course, but there is significant work going into this plan. Largely, you'll be reading it about universities. Of course, the key is for us to have a safe and a scalable return. So this isn't about placing undue risk. This isn't about placing someone ahead of the other. And I think this is going to take up, certainly our next couple of months will be very much focused on looking at how pilots are progressing. You would have seen the media around South Australia's pilot and their 3 universities. And interestingly, our colleagues in the Northern Territory and in Darwin as well have also made significant progress in this regard. Indicators for recovery. We actually have, I mentioned the positive of having more data, but there's also a negative of having more data, and we have data everywhere at the moment. And it's actually making sense of what are the indicators that we need to that we will be relying on. What are the indicators that can give us the best advice or the best early warning, and how do we make the best decisions in terms of where we're going to be able to re-engage. And importantly for Australia, I know I'm talking very much about a one-sided component of international education. I want to assure everyone in this room, of course, international education is much more than anyone coming here to Australia. It's our bilateral relationships, it's our New Colombo Plan scholars, it's our it's our mobility opportunities to connect in the region. And of course, this is going to have a significant impact on where we can do that and how we can roll out those programs successfully. I mentioned changing buyer behaviour. If you're interested in this, I have surveys and data galore. I've just picked one today as an example, which is from QS on the impact on higher education and student choice. And probably up until a month or so ago, we were seeing students holding on. We had seen deferrals depending on the course area, of course, or the individual student's case. But interestingly, these bottom ones here, studying in a different country, this is the space that there's quite a lot of contention in at the moment. The Australian government made a significant announcement around visa policy a couple of weeks ago, which if I was able to share this data with you again, I think it would look quite different, because under the visa flexibility, the Australian government has made a commitment to, one, to begin to reprocess student visas, which is obviously a very important part. Students need that for certainty, as do our institutions, but to recognise the online learning component for those students that hold a student visa and commence their studies, towards their studies and ultimately towards post-study work rights. That's a really important policy announcement that was made, and we're tracking very closely to see how that is changing students' perceptions, and obviously for our institutions to be able to manage more effectively and to scale up programs. Of course, how students experience Australia is the final element. We are working in an agency like Austrade, and with the number of clients and students that we connect with, we are uncovering some amazing stories of resilience, of mateship, of community support and involvement. And we've been doing this, as I mentioned, under the call to action of in this together, particularly with our state and territory partners. We are also aware, though, that there are very real challenges and pressures on a number of international students who may be here in Australia right now and whose economic circumstances have changed, either from them losing work or opportunities here, but also, of course, their families who may have been supporting their studies as well. It's a big role, I think, for us to be monitoring that, to be addressing that with our policy agencies to make sure that we are able to address those issues. And of course, the longer the conditions remain, the greater that challenge is. This is not unique to international students, of course, as well, and I'm aware of broader debates and conversations around temporary migrants in Australia, but also those who are impacted by COVID. So let me spend my last couple of minutes, I've lost track of time, but hopefully on what the path to renewal might look like. I do not have a crystal ball. I've never been one for forecasting, but I do want to share with you 4 policy areas that I think are going to significantly impact how we renew international education. I don't think for international education this is about recovering to what we had or simply resetting what we had. I have been so impressed with our institutions, with our leaders who are thinking differently about what opportunities they want to offer, whether that's in course programming, whether that's in new product delivery. But I'm also aware that our institutions will be facing some significant challenges to make around their workforce, around their business models moving forward. Particularly if you can imagine our English language colleges, a really key part of international education. And our English language colleges have no other service or market other than those students who are able to come and study with them. So I am acknowledging there will be, obviously, as with every industry, structural change. But the 4 areas I wanted to focus on today, and you could put them in other contexts, or you could have the Productivity Commission's reports, but these are the 4 that I've really pulled out that I can see give us a chance to make changes and to improve not only the experience for our international students and our international education offering, but of course, what education can deliver for Australia. And the first is how we fund research. That has been, for me, really interesting to see how front and centre that has been in the debate, but also how the opportunity for the sector to work with government and industry and actually many agencies of government in how we might address this. Because if I did have that crystal ball and a want for how we might recover from COVID and international education's role in that, I would say we want a science and technology-led recovery. We want to be able to maximise our knowledge, maximise our networks, maximise our relationships to be able to drive forward in a way that wasn't possible pre-COVID. And so funding, how we fund research is central to that. Our approach to global talent. We know that many students, whether they're undergraduate, postgraduate in our skills areas and others, do want to contribute their knowledge and skills to Australia, whether it's for a short time in post-graduation or whether it's for other options under skilled migration and permanent residency. And so how we approach our, or how we might reset our approach to global talent and migration settings is going to be a key factor in renewal. I couldn't talk about renewal without talking about institutional governance and particularly in the media we see that of course with our universities, but there is a significant opportunity for us to look at how we are managing our institutions and what we expect of the institutions in terms of their delivery and support for international education. And finally here, of course, we can't be working through COVID and not thinking about the broader foreign policy settings and of course our trade diversification agenda and what that may look like for international education. So I wanted to, I guess, close on those four, and I have some more data here. It's in the public domain, so I won't spend any time on it. But I do often get asked about the when I'm talking about institutional governance, about the percentage of international revenue that it contributes to institutions, and so I've got a slide here on a state-by-state breakdown. I think that also actually goes to those four policy areas that I focused on. So let me close by quoting something from our colleagues in McKinsey around the notion of moving from simply returning and returning to reimagining. And that we have an opportunity to stop seeing the return just as a destination and to work through the process to create opportunities, to learn from the various pilots and programs that we're going to need to deliver collectively, and to look at those different stages dependent on the location, the institution and or the business. And I thought the four areas to focus on: recovering revenue, rebuilding operations, rethinking the organisation and accelerating the adoption of digital solutions moving forward. So I'm going to leave it there in terms of my presentation. Really look forward to some questions and conversation. Thank you.
Don't go too far, but go a little bit far.
This way.
Okay.
Oh, that's right, yes.
Thanks very much for a wonderful talk this evening. It never ceases to amaze me if you think of the big export earners for this country: mining, tourism, prime industries and international education. Often I see how we treat international students we would never treat businesses or people in those other sectors, how we treat international students, and we really do have to lift our game when it comes to how we treat them. And this indeed reminds me of a little story. When I was in my old job as a minister, people would come in and see you and say, "Oh, Mr. Lucas, I'm so glad that you can see me." And I would say to them, "Hang on, your taxes pay my wages." And I don't think enough that we understand in our universities that the fees of international students pay the wages of academic staff and much of the research, and that we need to focus that customer focus. So can I ask you, can you offer any insights about the need, or are there exemplars for better student support, better customer focus amongst international students? And while you answer that, could those of you both in the room here and online think of some further questions that you can ask Rebecca whilst she's answering this one? Thank you.
Better student support, absolutely. That is one of the privileges in this job as well. You see the best, and you see some of the stuff that we wish wasn't happening. Best examples of student support. States and territories, I've spoken about them a bit in my presentation today, and I have worked for 2 states and territories. The role of student support and student experience is not just in the classroom. And I think that's been something that the Australian communities have understood better than many. And I would say we're actually right here in Brisbane, we have an example of great student experience programs that we're not expecting our individual institutions necessarily to run or to fund, but we're building into community. And we've seen that really firsthand during COVID with food banks, with support for international students that is being aggregated within the community. So I'll call out colleagues in Melbourne, in Brisbane, in Sydney, in Darwin, Adelaide. Every one of them has made a contribution, and not just on the, let's think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, not just on housing or food, but also around dealing with isolation, dealing with stress, looking for jobs, looking for employment. So I actually want to call out the states and territories on that and acknowledge that is in fact part of their role. In terms of institutions, I think those that are doing it the best started with the right kind of governance for how they listen to and engage with their current students. It's a bit of a theme of what I've been sharing tonight as well, but those that recognised for us to do this well, we need inbuilt mechanisms. So we're hearing from our students not when they fill out the, what's it called, the set at the end of the year to say, did my teacher do a good job, but actually we're gathering that real time. I would of course say Griffith because I am a graduate of Griffith, but I have indeed seen the Griffith Mates program and the peer-to-peer program there work really well. I do think the other area in terms of student support is, one of the things that we've noticed is there is actually a lot of support available. The challenge is how we're communicating that support to our students and their awareness or willingness to take up that. And I use mental health as an example. We actually know that there are a number of services, but if we don't get the messaging right, the cultural messaging right to communicate to a student or someone in need, they're not going to respond to the government fact sheet that says you should call this number. So I think what we're seeing and what I've been seeing in some of the work, and certainly our colleagues in Department of Education and in the National Mental Health Commission are leading on this as well, is how do we actually not just create new services, but change the way we're communicating those services so we're reaching more. Without a doubt, in addition to online learning and our quick pivot to online learning, we've also had to move online pastoral care and support. So I think there's some great examples of Austrade clients, technology companies, service companies that have really been able to scale during COVID. Vigo is one example here out of UQ and Brisbane that started a peer mentoring app and had been on a path to commercialising that and are now actually providing a service that would not have been possible prior to COVID and making a real impact. Paul's telling me there may be some questions.
We've got a lot of questions.
Oh, wow, okay.
Our next question, I'll take an online one, then I'll take one from the room here, is from former councillor Stuart Gill, former Queensland councillor, and Stuart's asked, could you comment on international higher education as a means of soft power in international relations? Certainly the Colombo Plan in its original manifestation, very much that case.
Indeed, and if I would, thanks for that question. Probably also tried to tease that out in the bilateral relations that are really being leveraged and in sometimes under pressure during COVID. So the soft power opportunity has always been huge. It is the history of our engagement. It has been the foundation of how we've engaged. We had a soft power review back in 2017, or commenced a soft power review, and having looked at that in the work that DFAT led, our universities, and not just universities, our education institutions are central to that. I have a personal view that I think we can do much more in terms of how we leverage our education for soft power benefits. That is one in how we who we're working with, but also how we're leveraging our graduates back in the region as well. In soft power, if we look at the tools that we have, we can sometimes get a bit stuck in here's a scholarship bucket, here's a research bucket, I'm looking at Greta, here's a capacity building program, but actually bringing it to its totality. That is something, when I spoke about the 4 areas that I'm hoping under foreign policy and our border arrangement, that our soft power opportunity would be better realised through and as we work through COVID.
Thank you. Now, our next question is in-house, Dr. Greta Nabs-Keller. Greta.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Rebecca, for a really insightful presentation of Austrade's response and where they're going with recovery. I would like to ask a question about China, but I won't. I will ask you a question actually which leads on from Stuart's on soft power, because as you're well aware, I mean, our soft power capability often lies in the Australian experience, in whether they're primary school students or high school students or university students or New Colombo Plan or, you know, Australia Awards, DFAT funded Australia Awards capacity building courses. They're coming to Australia for that Australian experience and the relationships and the understanding of culture and the strengthening of linkages. So I'm just wondering, my question pertains to the move to digitalisation and online learning, and whether Austrade have considered, you know, are there inherent risks in not physically bringing students to Australia for that experience, that educational experience?
Great question. I have a couple of examples that I could use to illustrate that, particularly with some of the capacity building programs out of DFAT that have been delivered online during this period. I think one of the reasons why they have worked is that they were small scale. So managing an online community in a way during one of the most stressful times in our lifetimes actually has delivered great results. We've seen examples out of, I'm trying to think where it was, Bhutan. I've seen one out of the Pacific as well that have continued. I think one of the problems is, I don't want to get into an either or of would you rather be in Australia or would you rather do it online from home. What we would like to see is, let's look at it in its totality. What could you actually, when we are perhaps jumping on planes again and visiting our friends, what could you do in the pre-departure to really build the experience of your leadership group that's going to come out? So you're doing all of that socialisation and that connection, that preparation. You're maximising the time whilst you're here in Australia, and then you're building in that way of working when you get home. And I think that you could see the same for our students who are coming here for 3-year programs. You could see the opportunity to deliver more in a shorter period of time. So the second example is a partnership that we piloted under the Study with Australia campaign, which was with FutureLearn. I'm not sure if anyone's participated in a FutureLearn course at any point in time. So one of the big platforms like Coursera, edX, FutureLearn actually does a lot with the British Council and with Study UK. And I'm not sure if we have any people from the UK on the line, but it was actually one of the reasons why we picked FutureLearn to partner with, because we wanted to partner with an organisation that had a different kind of reach, that was already working with online learners. We targeted programs where Australia had a distinct advantage, and we got to test and try what worked with different audiences. Most of the people who are on the FutureLearn program would probably never have come to Australia, would never have been able to experience Australia, whether it was because of their financial situation, their personal situation. So we actually have opened up new opportunities and new allies, I think, through that. But one of our messages in Renewal will be, how do we blend this? How do we make sure it's not online is the lesser opportunity? I do want to acknowledge though that I'm sure there are some experiences that have not been great in the online environment. It's pretty hard to deliver some components of our education in an online environment. So accepting where you can't do that, but also then amplifying the areas where you can.
Okay, next question is online and from one of our interns, Bethany Latham. Bethany asks, the pandemic has started a lot of conversations about Australia's self-sustainability and our possible over-reliance on China. With many of our international students hailing from China, do you see this as a potential issue for the industry? Or in other words, do you believe that a push for Australia as a whole to reduce our dependence on China would have a negative influence on our relationship in terms of international education? And if so, how should we approach this issue?
Oh, it's a very complex question. And I might need to drink water before I start that. I actually think that, again, it's not necessarily an either or. Students and parents from China will make choices on where they wish to study, on what courses and programs are of relevance to them. The key for Australia is to remain relevant, is to deliver what our clients or our students are looking for, whether they're from China, whether they're from India, whether they're from an emerging economy, whether they're from Mexico. But the trade diversification agenda, I think, does point to it's not just an education challenge, it's a challenge for all of Australian industry, but it's also an opportunity to deepen that relationship in a different way and to, I think, look at different delivery models. So one of the things that people may not be well aware of is Australia's investment in in-country teaching in China. The number of schools that are delivering Australian curriculum in China, our joint research institutes, our joint delivery centres. And during COVID, we actually have been able to work very positively with the Chinese government on recognition of online learning, which was not possible prior to COVID, was not something that we had in our business plan for this year of let's achieve that this year, but has been achieved because of the reality of the situation. So I think there's an opportunity in our relationship there with not just China, but in any market that is hungry for knowledge and for learning, to be able to meet them where they need to be, whether that's in market, whether that's online, whether that's here in Australia. And I do think there is still significant opportunity for us. Some of our institutions will need to make choices to the four areas. Some of our institutions may need to make choices about their institutional risk or their institutional governance around that. But that's I would say that's at a business level or an organisational level.
Okay, our next question is online and it's from HH Bow, BAU. Who are Australia's main competitors for international education provision? Would COVID mean them getting ahead and creating a larger threat than they would have been without COVID? You might want to do that in the context of why they choose markets, etc. as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the introduction, Paul, so the US has remained #1 destination for international students. And obviously with the current situation in the US, using the three diagrams of health, economy and political, we are well aware that there are a number of students who might be reconsidering their options for the US. Just above the US, of course, our colleagues in Canada have been at the top of the leaderboard if you were to rank countries and destinations in terms of international education. For over the past couple of years, their positive policy settings, their diversity of the students that they're attracting into Canada, and during COVID, they moved a bit earlier than Australia in making some of those commitments around visa flexibility and also around the student support elements. So if you were to look at a leaderboard and some of the ones that I have been looking at, Canada is certainly progressing well. But Australia does have a significant opportunity, and that is around the reasons why people choose Australia. One of the #1 choices why they choose Australia is safety. In being able to keep our population safe, or as many of our population safe as possible, and those who are resident here in Australia during COVID. That is certainly something that we want to be able to continue to maintain, but also to be able to align with our colleagues in New Zealand as well in terms of the opportunity in this part of the world. We have not seen a large shift in demand yet. So visas were opened and begin processing just recently, but applications to institutions have continued during this time. So we know that we are still in demand. It's how we actually convert that. I haven't spoken about the UK. The UK and Australia will be interesting to see post-COVID where both of our international education sectors end up. The UK has been much more advanced than we have in transnational education delivery, and they had to do that by design with some policy changes that were brought in a few years ago, and also with some concerns post-Brexit for the UK universities.
But broadly, that international market is an English-speaking language. They want to learn in English. Correct,
of course. Sorry, I missed the most obvious opportunity there, yes.
Okay, of course, one might observe that you couldn't have picked many better places in the world to study at Griffith University Gold Coast campus, but in terms of nice places to study and be at the same time. My next question, or the next question, is from our former National Executive Director, Melissa Comley-Taylor. Melissa asks, I'm interested if you know why South Australia was selected for the pilot of the return of international students with quarantine. As a Melburnian, I understand why it wasn't Victoria, but was Queensland in the picture?
Yes, okay, great question, Melissa, and I can't see you, but I'm waving to you. I think the key word there is selected. So every state and territory has the opportunity to bring together a secure corridor plan for their state or territory. Actually, I glossed over a COVID change, which happened quite quickly, but something that we've been spoken about for a long time, which is our National Cabinet now. Obviously, there is a National Cabinet for those considerations to be put in place. I am aware that every state and territory is planning and progressing. If you look at numbers, though, our South Australians have 3 universities in very close proximity. That I'm probably sure makes a difference, but it is a proposal from the state to the federal government and to various elements of the government, including health, home affairs, and others. The final part on that, which I forgot, was
South Australia.
Yes, South Australia. So South Australia, Northern Territory, you would have read the ACT. All of those have officially put in submissions. Other submissions are considered by Cabinet, and it does make it a bit tricky when you have a National Cabinet to talk about things that are being discussed in Cabinet. So.
I just as an observation, I suppose as well, you were mentioning earlier that there are many parts of Australia that could do with further economic development. For anyone who's interested in matters of urbanism, you've only got to look to Adelaide to see a city that has enormous further capacity for expansion in terms of the numbers that it could physically carry, and perhaps that may have been a motivating factor as well.
And I could just add to that too, because we work with the state and territory education agencies. We meet on a weekly basis, and the message from each of them is this is not a race to see who gets to run the first pilot. We are all in this. We're all in this together, and we want to understand how to best manage that. So whoever is ready at the time, then we're behind you, and let's back a safe and secure and a equitable way to do that. I did notice in the media some commentary about other Australians who are looking to return home, and interestingly, of course, each airport and each destination has its own caps in terms of returning travellers, so that's also a consideration for South Australia, given they haven't actually reached those caps before.
Excellent. So our last question tonight is from our newly elected council member, Graham Kerridge. Graham.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this very fascinating talk tonight. I was recently talking with a friend in a faith-based NGO who is supporting a lot of the stranded students. in terms of their rental accommodation, food and all sorts of support. And no doubt you have heard many of those often very, very distressing stories. In hearing her talk about it, it struck me that the response by local groups has often been very fragmented, with limited interaction between, the federal, state, local government, the education provider, and NGO sector. Have you seen good examples of where all these groups have come together? In particular, the local government sectors, who can play a really powerful role in easing a lot of the stress that these stranded students are under.
Yeah, I think a great question. I think the community response here in Australia has been phenomenal. Of course, the Australian government did make various contributions to our not-for-profit sector in order to support vulnerable Australians and those who are here in Australia. When it was first released, Red Cross was the main organisation that was cited as having received those funds and delivered those services. But of course, as we know, very many of our faith-based and more than 300 community organisations are involved in supporting international students. I'll use Oz Harvest as an example. What I think we found was because those community sectors hadn't worked with international students on scale, there weren't those relationships to know where to go, who to connect with, how to refer, or what other services were already available. Certainly we within Austrade, not that it's our policy remit, but in terms of getting the message out, worked with every major capital city, so with our colleagues in Hobart, in Sydney, in Brisbane, in Cairns, in Townsville, I won't list them all, to actually work on a community connection plan. So to understand which institutions were working with which community groups, which areas we could refer them to. Because if I go back to one of those challenges, there is nothing worse than sending someone to potentially receive help and then to be turned away from that help as well. So how we actually manage that, I think there's a huge opportunity for us to improve that and to actually use our community networks and community organisations to better connect our international students and those who are temporarily here with us to the Australian community. We've seen great examples of volunteerism back from international students who themselves are contributing back or who are setting up their own community groups, and we've got a lot of those examples online as well. I think it's something that we can do. We've got a great foundation. We can do better, and we'd love to be able to see that come out, not just in crisis, but when students are engaging in our community more broadly.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rebecca, for a really wonderful presentation tonight. Not only in fact highly relevant to the organisation and to the country, but very entertaining and informative. So really wonderful contribution. I think we all should remember that 28% of Australians are born overseas. That is one of the highest in the world, highest in the OECD, and dwarfs that of many other countries in Africa and Asia that are in many respects very small numbers of overseas born people. It's a great strength to this country, and this is really part of the opportunities. And when many people from overseas countries study here, they see a face that looks familiar to them, and that could be someone from China who was first in this country in the 1850s. So a great opportunity that we have, I think. So again, thank you. Could you all virtually acknowledge the wonderful Please stay in touch. We'll let you know what we've got coming up in the not too distant future. We'll be in contact with people in the near future with respect to our scholarships. So please, if you are a member, or indeed you are a member and know people who are potentially interested in our scholarships, we would like you to take note of that as well.